This podcast was created to educate listeners on the experiences of diverse individuals. However, all opinions expressed by the host or guests do not reflect the overall standing of Tarleton Radio or Tarleton State University.
Hello everyone and welcome to Making Space, a Diversity Dialogue. I'm your host Cole, and this is a bi-weekly podcast where together we'll have questions answered about socially sensitive topics while learning how to create lasting relationships with diverse people. How I approach this topic will be a little bit different, folks. Our discussion will be over learning disabilities, things like dyscalculia, ADHD, auditory processing disorder, and more. But we'll be looking at these disabilities through two different lenses. The first episode will be the administration side of things, those helping disabled folks and assigning accommodations. For the second episode, coming out a little bit later this month, we'll be talking to a student who has personal experience with her own learning disability. But to kick us off, we have Student Disability Resource Coordinator Jericha Hopson for this episode. She's with me to discuss learning disabilities. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And before we get too far into the episode, like always, I want to give a little bit of vocabulary. I've only got two big words that I want to address before we get into the questions. And first off is learning disabilities. Now, when I was doing a little bit of my research and kind of what I was able to come up with, is a disorder in one or more basic psychological processes that may manifest itself as imperfect ability in certain areas of learning, such as reading, writing, expression, or mathematics. Related disorders could be autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, auditory processing disorder, and many more. Does that kind of cover what that term means, Jericha, or is there different kind of ways of explaining it?
Well, there's different models of disability. So, the most popular medical model, social model, and rights-based model. So Each of those would likely define it differently. I think that's a good overall audience-friendly definition that I think can, encompass anyone regardless of their background and experience with disability. So I think that's an effective definition.
Okay, thank you. Then taking that definition, there are also what we call accommodations that are associated with disability in general, how we adapt certain things to help disabled folks. So again, there are adaptations that can be made to courses, to tests, how response style, setting that will assist a disabled person to complete the required material at, I'm guessing, the same level as non-disabled students. Is that kind of how Tarleton would define an accommodation, or is that similar? Is that different?
It's similar. I think the direction we would go with it is it's an academic adjustment made to ensure that the student has equal access.
Okay.
So I think that would be a definition Tarleton could get behind.
Definitely the equality there is important. Rather, we're not pushing disabled students further than, say, a non-disabled student. We're just making sure that they're on equal footing.
Right, and so that would be kind of the difference in access and success, right? So I would provide with equal access, but it'll be up to the student and all of the other resources on campus to make that success happen, but they're going to have the same opportunity as everyone else, and the educational barrier will no longer be there for that student. That's the goal.
Great. That's a good goal. And I wanted to start off the questions with kind of a little bit of a more personal direction and ask how you got into disability services and maybe what drives you to still be there.
So it's actually an interesting story. I went to Tarleton for my undergrad and my master's degree, and I was registered with the office. I have dyslexia, and I think I told you I have anxiety. That's I've got so I was registered as a student, and then whenever I started going to grad school, Dr. Trina Guy was the director there.
Okay.
And she agreed to take me on as a graduate assistant, and then I just kind of pushed from there and continued into a full-time position. And I'll be completing my doctorate in July.
Oh, and congratulations. That's big.
And I got accommodations in that program as well. So as far as, continuing to do this job, I want people to know that a disability, specifically, in this context, a learning disability, doesn't have any reflection on a student's intelligence. It's all about flexibility, and one thing that I'm most passionate about is universal design. So universal design in learning and instruction. So one of the key components of universal design is flexibility. So flexibility in course delivery, demonstrating mastery, and things like that. So I always give an example that because I'm dyslexic, my spelling isn't, it's not the best, right? But the content of what I'm trying to tell you is definitely there. So if I were dismissed every time I didn't use a comma appropriately, I would not be in this position. So I was lucky enough to be working with people who are flexible, which is a component of universal design, whether it's named that way or not, whenever they do it, for them to give me that flexibility and see that my message is here. It's just the comma that's missing. So
that's a very good example. And later on, I definitely want to go back and touch on interactions with folks, and specifically disabled folks, and accommodations, and how that goes about. But before I want to get too far into that, what kind of accommodations does Tarleton offer to those with learning disabilities?
So typically we don't list out the accommodations. Some universities do, but our stance on that is that every situation is handled on a case-by-case basis. So each accommodation is individual, and it's created so that the student has access, equal access. So what we do is I usually meet with all of the students, and we have a conversation about what their concerns are, and then we develop an accommodation plan from there based on their individual needs. So it's not necessarily a quote-unquote prescription of accommodations. Each plan is developed on a case-by-case basis.
Right. A lot of people like to think, especially in healthcare, about almost a prescription, a guideline of what to do. And I like the fact that Tarleton kind of waits and says, well, don't maybe go looking for certain accommodations. Just come talk to us, and we'll figure out what the best thing is for you.
Right. And one thing I tell all of my students is there's only one expert on yourself, and that's you, right? So I can look at your documentation all day. I can, look at what you provide all day, but I'm going to get the most important information from the student themselves. But in that same respect, some might consider me an expert in my field as well. So the two come together in that aspect to create what plan they need for access. But then also, I know we're going to talk about faculty later, but the customization that goes into working with each individual faculty is also very vital in the accommodation process.
Right. Let's go ahead and talk about faculty members and instructors then. What is the response from faculty members and instructors about having students with learning disabilities, or even disabilities in general? Are they responsive? Are they good? Or are they not so good?
So I actually had multiple meetings today, and I said this in multiple meetings. One thing that I'm most proud of at Tarleton is our faculty and the willing to be open and work with our students, but then also they are open to being re-educated or redirected, right?
Okay.
So, sometimes faculty go into it thinking, well, this is the way I've always done it. This is how I think it's correct.
Right.
But then it's brought to my attention, well, maybe that's not, exactly how we should do it. Let's sit down and talk about, why, because I'm not going to just go in and say, you're doing this incorrectly, you need to fix it, right? It's a collaboration.
Right.
They're a professional, I'm a professional. And sometimes we include the student, but sometimes it's just a general re-education session that we have. And I have found that 99% of faculty are completely open, and that conversation is usually quite pleasant. Every university is going to have some faculty that it's a little bit more difficult to work with than others. I can say Tarleton has far fewer than any other system school of the providers that I've talked with and interacted with. I would say that's one of Tarleton's strongest assets is our faculty's willingness to work with our students and my office.
So when you talk about having these meetings with instructors or faculty members, does that usually come after, or is it more of a beforehand kind of combat any sort of issues that happen in the classroom with compliance?
Basically proactive versus reactive, right?
Yes, that was the word I was looking for. Thank you very much.
No problem. I give this conversation a lot as well. So part of universal design is being proactive rather than reactive. That's one of the tenets of universal design as well. And I know I've mentioned it a lot. And the listeners, if you're interested in looking it up, it's making things accessible from the beginning. Mm-hmm. It was developed out of architecture, so building in the ramps from the beginning rather than adding them later.
Yes,
that kind of thing.
That would be more easy.
Yeah,
much easier.
And the ramps, they're helpful for people who are disabled or non-disabled, right? So someone who has a stroller, someone who's carrying a lot of things, it might be more beneficial to go up a ramp or an elevator than to try and make it up those steps. So that's a tenet of universal design, making things that were seen as quote unquote special accommodations for this specific population being something that's commonplace and just done from the start, right? Like putting a door on the building isn't special. It's done from the start because that's what has to happen for access for anyone.
Exactly.
So we do have a little session with new faculty during the new faculty orientation where we introduce our office and what we do, and then we meet with each college. So the College of Agriculture, the College of Education. They just changed the names of those colleges, and I don't know what they are.
Yes, I believe it is Agriculture and Natural Sciences.
Okay, that one. We meet with that one. So during the college meeting, it's the dean that calls it, and all the department heads are present, and any program directors are present. And so we kind of meet, reintroduce our office, and we say, this is what we're doing. This is kind of what we need from you. The other half of my office is the testing center.
Right.
So we talk about using the testing center, what kind of tests we offer and things like that. But we do meet with the colleges. And then aside from that, I'm always open if someone reaches out to do any training or anything like that. I've worked with Emily Van Kirk quite a bit.
Yes, we know her.
Yeah, I believe, I think I might have attended a talk where you talked, and I was probably on Zoom and I didn't stop talking. Other than that, yes, I do deal with a lot of reactionary conversations, just because I rely so heavily on our students to let me know if something's going wrong, because they're the ones in the moment, and again, they're the expert on themselves.
Right.
So I can include the student in the conversation initially and identify them if they'd like, but usually I can go into a conversation with a faculty member, keep the student's confidentiality intact, and then we can just talk in general about their understanding of X, Y, and Z accommodation. Or, we'll go into specific scenarios. Mostly, the issues I deal with, it's just a misunderstanding or a miscommunication.
I see.
Yeah.
Are instructors and faculty required to comply to this method, this universal method?
Not universal design.
Oh, universal design.
Yeah,
okay.
Not that. And it's not an officially adopted concept or disclaimer there.
Okay.
It's my own, what I try to push.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is it's a thing, right? It's a national thing. It's just not something, formally endorsed at Tarleton.
Right.
But it is something that I'm encouraging, just because after COVID especially, so for example, the recording of lectures, that would be extremely helpful for a large portion of my students.
Of course.
And it's helpful for students in general, to be able to review that material. And honestly, whenever we look at what is a faculty assessing, they're assessing whether or not they mastered the content, not whether or not they were able to write down notes.
Exactly.
So that's a concept that could be seen as universal design. I believe it's moving to faculty discretion.
Okay.
But, if I'm asked about it, that is the conversation that I have. So, yes, there is federal and state legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act and then the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended.
Yes.
So both of those require any university who receives state or federal funding to abide by the ADA. Private universities have to do it as well. They're just under a different title.
I see.
So they do. But with that being said, it's still a collaborative effort. Like I said at the beginning, I don't prescribe these things. So the faculty member is the content area expert. I'm the expert in this field. The student is the expert in themselves. So if a faculty member ever feels like it's a fundamental alteration, an accommodation cannot fundamentally alter the core foundations of a course.
Right.
So in that case, no, the accommodation wouldn't apply, but it's a conversation. It's not just the faculty member saying, no, I'm not going to do this. But it's important that the student lets me know if that ever does come up, so we can have that dialogue and open that conversation.
That's great. It's great. It's very much, I never thought about it in a group kind of method, but it definitely is a group kind of cycle that happens. That's very interesting.
Yes, definitely. And confidentiality is quite important for me, but I have found that as we move forward and there's more of an acceptance of disability as part of identity, that students are more and more open to have that discussion and be identified. Just like you have a student who obviously has been comfortable and they're going to be coming in, that has extremely helped not only myself, of course, but those who are not in the disability world, right? It helps them, whether they know it or not. Everyone comes in contact with someone who has some form of disablement. Everyone does. And at some point, most everyone will experience that, but they don't put it in that context right away. So students being open and willing to have those conversations with faculty, with you, with other students, it re-educates everyone and makes disability not taboo to talk about.
It makes it more visible, and that's really what we like to see on this show, is the education value, but just, hey, this is a group that's here and that need to be heard.
Yes, and our population has actually grown substantially. So the Amendments Act was passed in 2007, 2008, and it broadened the scope of what's considered a disability in order to be protected under the ADA.
Okay.
So that opened the door for who's eligible for accommodations in post-secondary education. So obviously I wasn't here in 2007, but we have almost 600 students registered with us.
Wow.
And when you look at the larger population of Tarleton, obviously that's not a huge population. It's not a huge segment, especially when you look at other marginalized groups. But the disabled population is a marginalized group, and it should be treated that way.
Definitely.
But whenever you compare our numbers to, say, other system schools, or other schools our size in general, we do have quite a large population.
Okay.
So it is becoming more, I wouldn't say easy, but less stigmatized for students to come forward and say, I need these things. I'm going to work hard, but I'm going to let you know what I need as well.
That's good. That's good. I guess, at least on my end, I didn't know how many students were really involved in disability services, and if that was something that needed to be worked on, that people should know that they can come up to you and just be like, hey, I need these things. And that kind of brings in a question that I had, which is, besides faculty, because you mentioned that you mentioned the faculty training, instructor training, and that you go and introduce yourselves to different departments, do you do something similar with students that maybe wouldn't think to ask otherwise?
So we do. I wanted to start with there's a required syllabus statement about the office and how they can contact us. It's in every syllabus.
I see.
But most syllabi are 14 pages.
Yes, definitely.
So
that's something that's in all of them, and I can't say that I've read it fully.
Yeah, no, and it's completely understandable, but it is in all of them. We are involved if there's orientation or anything like that. One thing that can be confusing for some people who maybe don't work in the office is legally the student has to make first contact with the office. We cannot, someone says, oh, I think the student needs your help, I can't reach out to them. They have to reach out to us.
I see.
That protects the student as far as self-disclosure and things like that, because they're the only expert on themselves, right? So they're going to know if they need help. They just need to know the resources there. But yes, and we have a partnership going with student development and mentoring right now.
Okay.
I'm super excited about it. We actually presented at the Association of American Colleges and Universities.
Wow.
Yeah, so excited. And it was virtual, so that I didn't have to travel, so that was exciting.
That's good.
But I've started it with student development and mentoring, where I'll meet with a student, and so many times students expect services to be centralized. So oh, you're a student with a disability, so you go here for this, this, and this. I don't want that at all. I feel like, that's pushing us so far back to almost a separate but equal concept. I want students to be able to access the same resources as everyone else. I want advising and tutoring and student success coaching to be accessible to these students regardless of disability status, because a lot of times what they're needing is exactly what a success coach does, but they are under the false understanding that they have to go through me to get it, and that's not the case. So what I do is I create a referral with the student's consent, and I talk a little bit about how their disability may directly impact their academics based on our conversation, and what kind of resources I think would be helpful for the student success coach to employ with the student or provide to the student. But then also that provides that student success coach with these resources that, you know, maybe were initially created for disabled students, but would be beneficial to so many other people. And a good example would be if a student comes to a success coach and they say, I'm having a hard time keeping up with the reading done outside of class. So I'm dyslexic. That was a major problem that I had. It's a major problem that a lot of my students who have reading disorders have. But also, a lot of people have trouble with it because finding the time to sit down to dedicate to actually read the stuff and all of that.
I completely
so
understand.
there's some programs where you can, so for example, there's one called Snap and Read on your phone. You take a picture of it and it converts it to PDF so that it can be read to you.
Okay.
So there's that. Obviously, there's audiobooks. If it's there's a program called Natural Reader that I use. It's my favorite. So anything on the computer, if you can highlight it with your cursor, this program will read it to you.
Oh, okay.
There's a free version. It's called Natural Reader. There's a free version.
I'll try to link that.
And it's actually fantastic because it's very simple to use. And for me, it's not so much that I need it to read to me slow or anything, so I speed it up very fast. I just need to be able to hear it and see it in order to take it all in. But that would be beneficial to working parents. It would be beneficial to people who commute. None of those are disabilities.
Right, but it can be applied to other
Right.
students. It's,
Right.
And that's very important.
And now our success coaches and our mentors, that department is being exposed to those resources. And eventually I want to branch that to all of the student services departments on campus. But I'm wanting to get the framework established with student development and mentoring because I think they're the most immediately helpful for the students coming in. It's a wonderful department. So everyone, student development and mentoring over there with Dr. Manenshaki.
That's great. I was actually about to, my next question was going to be, in your opinion, where do you see that the disability services has room to grow, or if it has room to grow, where do you see it going?
So what I want to do is, to a certain extent, work myself out of a job, right? I don't want things to be special accommodations anymore. I want them to be things that are built into a course. They're part of pedagogy. They're part of, instruction and learning. So obviously there's going to be some things that universal design can't really address. So testing, for example. Most people don't take college test or college type test once they graduate and they're in the workforce, right?
Right.
So that's kind of an exception. But being able to work with students to build those skills and faculty to help them build those skills in order to bridge to the workplace so that they can find those resources for themselves once they get out there, or to help incorporate that into their workplace already. I really want to do that. I'm obviously passionate about universal design.
Yes.
I do have job security, though, because it's the law. But mainly I want to do some education. And we did recently change our name. So we did used to be referred to as disability services, but we're now disability resources.
Resources. Okay.
And so it's only a single word change, but it is so much more than that for a lot of people, but for myself especially, as far as the philosophy and the direction that I would like to go. I don't want to be a service as in we do this for you. I want to be a resource and let's educate you, let's work together, let's make this happen, let's make sure we don't have any issues, let's make this accessible from the start. And it's not student disability services anymore, it's just disability services, because accessibility is a university-wide responsibility. It's not the responsibility of a single department or the student to go to battle for themselves.
Right.
It's the entire university. So that's really what I would like to do. I'd like to open it up to, okay, accessibility is the responsibility of everyone.
Right.
Let's figure out how we can do it, because so often disability is trapped in the single department that has disability in their name, right? And I think that does a disservice not only to the disabled students, but the non-disabled students as well, as far as exposure to diversity, like what you're doing with this dialogue.
Definitely.
So So my personal vision for the office would be to follow the models of disability. So obviously the medical model of disability is the most traditional so to speak, model. It's the one where it's medicalized. It's an inherent problem with the individual. It's something that needs to be cured, and so on and so forth.
Right.
It has its place. It has its place in the medical field. I can see how that's important in the medical field. Doesn't have its place here or in advocacy or anything like that. Then you move to the social model of disability, which is quite popular. It has a lot of flaws, which have been addressed, but in that aspect, that's whenever we get into the conversations about language. So identity first versus person first and things like that, and looking at how society contributes to barriers and how they put up barriers.
Right. That makes sense.
Yes.
We can kind of see that in a lot of different ways, especially right now, not just with disability, also with race and sexual orientation and gender identity as well.
Absolutely. And there is a lot of crossover. So conversation about critical race theory is really heating up right now, of course, but there's DISCRIT, which is critical disability theory. So there's a lot of overlap as far as, advancements of rights and awareness with race, LGBTQ. So a great example for LGBTQ is the Q, right? Queer used to be, insulting, used to be a dirty word. The same for disabled, right? Sometimes it's hard for people to understand that that's no longer, or it shouldn't have ever been, but it's not a dirty word anymore. It's part of identity. A disabled person is okay to say. That's identity first. That's identity development, which really should be happening in college. That's whenever a student figures out what their identity is. And so if we can normalize saying disabled, it's going to be extremely helpful, just in the larger picture, in getting students what they need that is kind of beyond the curriculum, right? It's human development.
Right.
And then you move into the rights-based model of disability, which is really the arena that I would like to work in. And it gets a little confusing because the rights-based model is not as concerned with advocacy as the social model.
That makes sense.
Right? So I think a university has an obligation to abide by the ADA, which is a legal document, right?
Yes, definitely.
And I think sometimes whenever we kind of bleed over into advocacy, sometimes it may blur the intention of the ADA, right? And sometimes it can make it difficult for service providers to see their way through, okay, this is what they need in order to have access. If I do this, I know they're going to be successful. Right? So that can get a little confusing. So if the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and International Affairs, if they can kind of adopt the social model of disability and see disability as part of diversity and part of culture, that is where those students can go to get that social support, just like they have mental freedom and BOLD. I know they had those going, but seeing disability as culture and diversity follows that social model, while the legal and federal compliance happens just like in the Title IX, the Office of Civil Rights. That's where that happens. It's
okay,
right? So there's a legal arm to make sure they're getting what they need, but then there's the advocacy arm, which it's exactly the same for race, LGBTQ. It's the same concept and the same model. So just like we've taken from their efforts for other progressive movements, we can do the same for this. But more and more you're seeing the centralized idea of service. So you have a disability, so you go to tutoring over here, not over here, right? And I can see how that could be appealing, but it's also damaging. It's segregation.
It still creates the separate,
right? And so I don't think people see the damage it does to disability identity whenever that stuff like that happens. That's why I think it's important to keep the legal compliance here, right? Because legal compliance is very, very different than what happens in diversity and inclusion.
Of course.
Right? So that's where I'm interested in, because it's clear, right? And I can be a consultant. I can say, this is what the legislation says. It's actually not clear at all. It's up to a lot of interpretation, but it requires someone to have a mindset that can see multiple angles. But whenever you work in advocacy, or you're solely consumed by the social model of disability, it can be hard to see any other angle.
Right. So you want to look at this in a way, a sectioned off state, but a state that is also in kind of a cycle of working together at the same time. It's a lot of balance, I can tell, from making sure a disabled student is able to be an individual and have that independence associated with it. You're very much like, we're a resource center, so they come to us when they need resources versus you have to come to us because we are the disability services. But it's also, we don't want you segregated essentially just to us. It's getting more outreach and more acceptance, definitely more acceptance. And that's not a lot about what you think of when you think of disability. You're like, well, at a point, anyone can be disabled that you talk to, but it's also, there's a lot of things that disabled folks don't have that other people have been fighting for, that other people have gotten, that disabled folks just don't have. And with your kind of outlook on it and where you want to grow it, we're moving toward that. Well, everyone can be disabled, everyone can be in that point, or anyone rather, can be disabled that you talk to, but they're also just a part of regular society, not on a different class level.
Yes, and one thing that's popular in the disability studies community is that the disability population is one of, if not the only marginalized population that anyone can join at any point unexpectedly in their life.
Right.
And so, but a lot of times it's not seen as a marginalized population because it's not seen as culture, it's not seen as diversity. We've made great progress in that aspect, but if you'll notice that a lot of kind of diversity departments, disability isn't a huge component.
Right.
I know Emily is a very passionate advocate for disability, and we work together quite often, so I know we're working towards that. But I think a lot of times disability kind of gets pushed out of the diversity picture. And I am quite passionate about that. So that would be an interesting project if I did get kind of the ultimate goal of, okay, this is the rights-based model, this is the social model. And being a disabled student and a staff member, I feel like I do have a different perspective on certain things.
Right.
And being able to relate to the students, but then also being able to communicate to the faculty and the staff. And since I have been here since I was a student, I do know a lot of them and have that relationship already there. But I want to build a framework to where, if I'm not in this position anymore, that relationship with the office, not just me, is still there.
That's very good. That's very good. When we're looking at prospective students who are disabled, what kind of advice would you give them, thinking about everything you said, thinking about the universal kind of model that you're talking about? What advice do you give to students who are coming into college right now?
So in general, every university is going to have a similar process. The student has to make the initial contact. Typically, we can't take any action until after the student's been enrolled. So my advice as a high school freshman would be to make sure your documentation is in line. Make sure your school has provided you what you need, but also make sure you understand what your disability is. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What are your coping skills? What has worked for you? Because I need them to be able to communicate that to me, because they are an expert on themselves, but whenever they're not an active agent in their education in high school, perhaps, then they're not able to communicate that with me, and so I'm not able to get that expertise that I need to move forward. So I think understanding their strengths and weaknesses, either due to their disability or due to the type of student they are, regardless, is going to be important. But also looking at the university you want to attend, figuring out, okay, how do I reach out? What's my first step? We have something called the initial contact form. It's an online document that they'll fill out, and it comes directly to me, and I review everything. And I follow up with the student, but making sure you have your documentation, making sure you understand what the university is going to expect from you in the way of documentation, because every university is a little different. So that would kind of be my main thing, would be getting what you need from your high school before you graduate.
Right.
is going to be ideal.
That's important.
Yeah. Another thing would be to understand your documentation, understand what you're looking at. A good example is for students who need to take the teacher certification exam, the documentation that I deemed acceptable, right, for accommodations, the third-party private company that owns the teacher certification exam may not.
Okay.
So understanding what that documentation is and what the limitations of that documentation are would be really important. So I think mainly becoming more of an active agent in their own education and their own advocacy, because it is hard for parents sometimes for any parent, regardless of the student's disability status, to see them go from, you've been in my house for 18 years and now I'm just dropping you off. Right.
The independence aspect that we kind of mentioned before. It's not something, it's really, really easy to kind of let your guardians or your parents take over where you initially go after high school or during high school. So it's just being a little, like you said, a little more active in the education process. It's important, and what your disabilities are, and really kind of learning yourself in that. It's very important.
Definitely. Identity development, I think, is way more important than people give it credit for during the time at college. And accepting disability as part of identity is only going to enhance the person's ability to know themselves. Right. Not thinking of it as something that's less than or lacking. A disability is a part of identity. And it's okay to be disabled. Right. And it's okay to accept that as part of your identity.
Now, still kind of on the realm of advice, what kind of advice or any kind of thoughts you can give to maybe faculty or teachers or instructors about having disabled students in the classroom? And I know we don't want to segregate kind of in that way, but there are different elements of accommodation, and like you said, building a curriculum. What advice do you have on that aspect?
So we have the Center for Educational Excellence, and each college has its own instructional designer. And our instructional designers are fantastic. We've met with them before. They're all on board with the universal design concept and helping their faculty get to that point. They were instrumental in making sure things were accessible when we made that shift to online, especially with the captioning and making sure those things are in place. So for the faculty member, it would be contacting their instructional designer about possible accessibility, but then also I think being flexible without being over accommodating is important. Okay. So if it's not written on their accommodation letter and you wouldn't do it for any other student, don't do it for this student, right? Because we've determined this is what they need for equal access. But if it's something you would do for everyone, like providing the recording, like we all had to do, then yes, let's do it. Let's do it for all of them. Does it give anyone an advantage to be able to review your content and your lecture that I'm sure you spent a lot of time to prepare? Of course. Why would you want them to only have one viewing?
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that before.
So there's, I think there's just flexibility is important, and I think faculty especially learned a lot about flexibility during COVID, and some of them may be bent to breaking point, but still being open to that flexibility would be what I would advise. And I think, like I said earlier, I'm very, very proud of our faculty.
Right. Okay. Are there any topics or elements, whether that be like the administration side of learning disabilities or disabilities in general, that we didn't cover that you wanted to make sure to mention?
I think mainly I want to talk about or mention the importance of self-advocacy and communication. So there's a difference in self-advocacy and battling, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so self-advocacy is what I expect, but battling is not what should happen. That's whenever a student needs to reach out to me so that I can help step in and engage in that conversation, but also understanding that having a disability doesn't automatically put you in, a box, right? So the expectations are all still the same. You just have something that has taken away the barrier for, if a class is hard, for everyone, it's probably going to be hard for a disabled student as well. Right. The accommodations don't make things any easier, and the type of accommodations given in high school are very different than those given in post-secondary education, because we're actually governed under two different legislative bodies. It is very different. And so making that transition can be difficult. And if you think about an 18-year-old freshman coming in and they're thinking, well, I've had these for years and years and years, it's just going to transfer over, it's going to look exactly the same. It doesn't. So I think it's important to recognize that and understand that there are other ways to bridge the gaps, the perceived gaps.
Right.
One thing that I think is the most upsetting for me is if a student tells me that I didn't help them. Right. And I can understand when a student is upset and, they received X, Y, and Z in high school forever, and it's just not something that, translate over into college. I think the willingness for faculty to be open to re-education should also be there for students to understand why I'm doing these things. I'm not doing them because, I don't want to be helpful to you or anything like that. But that is hard to hear. And I'm sure it's hard to hear for anyone. But I am personally invested, right? Not only in the job, but in the students, because I know I went through it. I understand. But also the independence and the autonomy, and, there's a bridge from high school to college, but then there's a longer bridge, right? From college to career. And that's what we're trying to do here. So I think I just want people to know that I'm a nice person, and you can come and talk to me or send me an email. I brought some cards for you if you want them.
That's great.
And communicating with me does not always mean you're going to get exactly what you want, but we're going to work together to get you to a place that you're going to get what you need.
Right. That's important. Well, thank you so much for discussing all of this with us and talking to the listeners about this, because it's not something people think about if they aren't disabled, to think well, how can I help my students, or even how can I help my children or my children that are under guardianship or anything like that. How can I help my students actually get through those barriers, and how do I start off my curriculum like that? So that's really, really important. So thank you so much for joining us. All right, folks, we went over a lot of information, and there are still plenty of material out there and plenty of topics left to learn about. If you would like to know more, or maybe I didn't cover something you were curious about, be sure to check those links in the description for some additional resources about the topic we discussed today. And be sure to check back next upload for the second half of this topic, where I'll bring in a student to discuss her experiences with her own learning disability. That'll be Tuesday, July 27th at 5 p.m. will be the next upload. For regular updates on the show, find the Planet 100.7, the radio station we're based out of, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at the Planet 100.7. One last time, I'd like to thank my guest, Miss Jericha Hopson, for coming on and talking to me and discussing with us. And thank you, listeners, for following along and learning all of this with me. Until next time, be safe out there, folks, and take care.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from me, Taylor Welch.
And me, Brianna Blanks. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.